The following podcast is taken from a live broadcast on Inspire FM.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, listeners. This is Inspire FM and you're listening to the Ask Your Lawyer show on Monday from 7 till 8. My name is Gais Uddin. I'm a director at Wolf & Company Solicitors. And today we've got a fantastic show on for you, and it's related to fraud. What is fraud? How is it committed? What types of fraud are there? We're going to take a general look at the benefit fraud guidelines as well. What I want you to do, listeners, if you've got any questions whatsoever or you want to make a comment, please do call in on 01582 481 822. You can also WhatsApp and text on 07779 481 822. I think we're being live streamed on Facebook. You can Twitter. There's Instagram and a YouTube account as well, I think. So do have a look. Whatever means is preferable to you, go on there and have a look. Do call in. We really value your input. Joining me today is a very good friend of mine who is an extremely talented barrister, the lovely Leslie Manley of Church Court. Hello, Leslie.
Hello, Gais. Thank you very much for inviting me on your show.
Thank you very much for coming. Leslie is actually, should I say, an experienced barrister who's done a lot of work and good work around hearts, beds and bucks. She'll be very familiar to my clients, certainly, and she's assisted in criminal cases as well as civil cases as well. Leslie, you're a barrister from Church Court Chambers, is that correct, yeah?
That is correct, yes.
Tell us a bit about Church Court Chambers. What do they do? What kind of work they do?
Well, Church Court really came into being in about 2013 when Karim Fuad headed up the chambers. We're really fortunate because it's in the most beautiful location. We have the Temple Church opposite. It's great chambers, really lovely people. Predominantly criminal work for many people. Mm-hmm. There are quite a lot of people in chambers who also have other specialities, human rights, immigration, several fields of law really, but vast majority of people do criminal work.
And listeners, if you do need any representation and you've got solicitors, you can even go out without solicitors because some of the barristers do direct access. You can look at the website for Church Court Chambers and have a look at the experts there. You are allowed to request any expert that you want to represent you. Right, Leslie, we'll talk about your personal background in the second half of the show, but I wanted to crack on with the subject today, fraud. Just general overview, what is fraud, and generally describe what kind of legislation it's covered by.
Well, to simplify it as much as possible, fraud is really where a person is acting dishonestly, where a person's not being honest, and they're really engaging in some form of deception, and that's either to make a gain for themselves or to cause a loss to someone else, or to expose another person to the risk of loss. So really dishonesty is a key issue with fraud.
All right. When you say gain for themselves, give us an example. What does that mean? That they want to make money for themselves, is it?
Yes. Fraud, typically people tend to think of fraud as something very boring, very document heavy, very paperwork orientated. Yeah. But fraud actually can be committed in many, many ways. And so the idea of making gain for yourself, as you've just asked me, for instance, very simple example, I've had two cases recently. Two clients separately have gone into banks and they've tried to withdraw money from an account. The fraud being the accounts were not theirs. They were pretending that they were their bank accounts and that they were entitled to that money. So that's really one clear example of trying to make a gain for yourself.
Right. On the same side of that coin, though, if I went into a bank and tried to withdraw money from somebody else's account, presumably that loss to someone else is covered there as well because you're making the bank lose money. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Generally talking, and let's have an overview about this. How does fraud... what happens if you're convicted or you plead guilty to committing a fraud, what can happen to you?
Well, there are sentencing guidelines that are laid down, and as I was explaining, frauds can be perpetrated in just so many ways. There's the example I just gave you. There's making false declarations on documents, so trying to obtain a mortgage, for example, that you're not entitled to.
Okay.
People making fake insurance claims, pretending they were ill.
Let's use one of those examples, yeah? Let's use one of your examples. Somebody goes into, or does a fake insurance claim, and the insurance claim, let's say the risk covered was 500,000, 600,000 pounds. Tell us how they would get punished for those kind of things. What kind of things would the courts and police look into before they start punishing these types of people?
Well, there are now very clear guidelines set down. So the judge would look at, firstly, what's called culpability.
Okay, yeah.
So what I'll do, if this is all right, is I'll take you through what is meant by
absolutely, that would be
culpability.
Yeah.
So there are 3 brackets. The highest is bracket A, high culpability, then B, medium culpability, and C, lesser culpability.
Okay.
So what the court would look for is in respect of A, so whether there's high culpability.
Just so our listeners know, I'm sure most of them do, culpability, just in simple terms, what is culpability? Is it
responsibility, guilt? Okay. That's really, how guilty, responsible you are.
Yeah, brilliant.
Is how I would put it. It's to simplify it.
Okay, yeah.
So what the court would look for is whether the person played a leading role when offending's part of a group activity. In the example you've just given, it that doesn't arise because it's one person, I think, making a fraudulent claim. Involvement of others through pressure or influence.
Obviously doesn't apply here.
Doesn't apply. Abuse of power, position of power or trust or responsibility. Doesn't really apply here. Sophisticated nature of offending, significant planning.
Let me take you one step back in that abusive position. What if I was like a mortgage broker or something, and I had inside knowledge of how the workings of this? Would that technically be me abusing my power? Or if I was in a bank, for example, and working for the bank, and I thought, right, I know what's going to happen here. I'll use my position and put through a quick thing. Would that be part abuse of power?
In my opinion, I think it would. I think you would fall into that category because you have a position of trust and responsibility.
Okay.
It's arguable, but I think that you would.
Okay.
Significant nature of offence, sophisticated nature of offence, significant planning. Arguably, if you go to the trouble of submitting an application in that way, it's not spur of the moment thing, I wouldn't have said. It could fall into that category. Fraudulent activity conducted over sustained periods of time. That doesn't really apply in this sort of case. It's not, for example, an employee going in and systematically cooking the book, so we call it. Deliberately targeting victim on basis of vulnerability. That wouldn't really apply here with a financial institution.
No.
So the judge would look to see if any of those factors are present. If they are, then you would go into that bracket to start with. If they're not, you would then look at medium culpability. So it's got here a significant role where offending is part of group activity, and other cases where categories A or C are not present. Category C is a lower one.
Even lower, yeah.
Yeah, so that kind of covers, it gives the court flexibility.
It does seem to, doesn't it? Yeah.
And then lesser culpability is involved through coercion, intimidation or exploitation. That would not be this case. That sort of thing happens sometimes when people, in my experience, people have come here to work, they don't have family, friends, and then they're taken advantage of by somebody more established.
Yeah.
That's one example. Not motivated by personal gain. Peripheral role in organised fraud. So if you're a real small player in a sort of gang-type setup. Opportunist one-off offence, very little or no planning. Limited awareness or understanding of the extent of fraudulent activity.
I want to take you to a couple of these points, actually, Leslie. Yeah, not motivated by personal gain. Presumably, if you're committing a fraud, you're always motivated by some kind of gain, aren't you?
Yes, you are, but there can be instances where it's not so much that you're greedy for money, that you've done something maybe to help a family member or there's some mitigating circumstance. You're not just doing it for your own self.
Right.
So, for instance, with benefit fraud, that I think that you're going to ask me about later, there's a big difference between someone calculatedly doing a benefit fraud because they, as one of my clients did, wanted to have a holiday in New Zealand, as opposed to someone doing it because a relative was sick and they were desperate to feed them.
Right.
So it's that kind of...
that kind of nuance in each case. Yeah, they look to see what was the real motivation behind it.
Yeah, so I can really see the force of your question, because generally, yes, people steal or do frauds usually to get something for themselves. Yeah.
So immediately, though, when you're looking at those three kind of things, the how guilty you are, high, medium, or lesser, presumably a barrister like yourself or counsel like yourself, you'd go in and immediately your job would be, if your client was facing this kind of issue, to bring the client's culpability down as much as possible. Yeah.
Definitely, yes, because that can make a big difference. Well, as you know, because of your extensive experience as a solicitor, you know that if you can put them in a lower bracket, it really helps them. Yeah,
and listeners, from my own personal experience, and I'm sure Leslie will vouch for this. And we're not just saying we can do this job, other people do this job. When you have good counsel and you have good solicitors, the first thing that they try to do is chip away at these types of things and bring people down in the categories, and that will help. That's the first step in helping them get an appropriate. People seem to think it's lesser. It's not lesser, an appropriate sentence, and that's what the whole aim of the game is. Because a lot of people say, why should people get a lesser sentence? It's not about lesser or higher, it's the most appropriate, and a judge will look through it and give them the most appropriate, and all we need to do is point out the facts and fit them to the guidelines. The next thing that they look at, or the judge will look at, and Leslie, is harm.
Is harm, yes, that's right. So once you've been decided which category you've gone into, the harm, and it's quite interesting because it's set out in financial terms.
Okay.
So category 1 is £500,000 or more.
Right.
The starting point of sentence based on £1 million. Category 2 is 100,000 up to £500,000. And then category 3, 20,000 to 100,000, or the risk of to a person. Category 4, 5,000 to 20,000, or risk of. Category 3, harm. And then less than 5,000 is category 5. So the sentencing depends up to a point on the loss and the risk of it, the exposure to the risk of loss.
See, ordinarily you might think that that's pretty easy to categorise, because you'll say, well, let's see how much you were aiming to take off someone or aiming to lose, or what representation that you made. But I suppose it can be argued, can't it, in actually what you were aiming to harm someone, or the risk, I suppose. And I've seen you, Leslie, quite eloquently argue this in court as well, and bring down what people thought was huge cases into much lower. And benefit fraud seems to be a particular one where this can happen, where people say, and I've seen prosecutors say, well, the risk was 100,000, for example, and then in reality, when you argue it down, it comes down to much, much less than that.
That's right.
Do you want to give any examples? Can you think of any off the top of your head? If you can't, we can...
I can't, sorry, not off the top of my head, but I will be thinking.
Yeah. So obviously they'll take the first thing, which is the harm. Then they'll look at the category of loss. Like I say, if we said £600,000, so this guy will be category 1 in this. Wouldn't he? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
So,
and then what's the last thing that they look at?
Well, they look at the impact. So high impact, victim impact. And what I think is quite interesting about this is that you can have, in fact, a case I was involved in, one person lost £10 million. So he was the biggest financial loser, and you would think that he would be the one that suffered the most. But in fact, because he was a multimillionaire, he could bear to lose 10 million. He wasn't happy about it, but he could bear to lose it. Whereas someone who lost a lot less, but was a widow, and it was her life savings, the impact on her was massive.
Yeah. So they look at that. Do they really look into those kind of details? Obviously, it'd take a good officer at the start of it to take those kind of statements, wouldn't it, to present that to the court?
Yes, but where it's set out here for high impact, serious detrimental effect on the victim, whether financial or otherwise. For example, it's put here, substantial damage to credit rating, for instance. Victim particularly vulnerable due to factors including, but not limited to, their age, financial circumstances, mental capacity. So that very much is on the scale, or falls really with what I was trying to say about the 10 million versus the old lady who lost her life savings. Then there's medium impact. So that says here considerable detrimental effects on the victim, whether financial or otherwise, or lesser impact, some detrimental impact on the victim, whether financial or otherwise. So the court factors all that in as well. How
arguable are those kind of things, and how provable are they, to be honest? If someone comes and says, well, look, listen, you've devastated me left, right and centre, and they're actually multi-millionaires or something like that, and how much could you argue? Or does it depend on how much work the solicitor's done in the background to dig these things out?
Well, some of it is on the face of the actual papers, because you'll know that one victim is saying one thing, and you will see that she's an elderly lady whose bank account has cleaned out. The same with big companies. You will see that, yes, they've lost 10 million, but they actually turn over $1 billion a year. But other times, the work done by the solicitors is very crucial to, as you put it, and I think, if you don't mind me saying, that was really well put, getting the appropriate sentence for people. As you know, on top of the face of the papers, by which I mean what we get from the prosecution, they do now go and get a victim impact statement from people. So, but yeah, definitely, work done by solicitors is often very crucial.
Okay, we've taken our example, £600,000.
Yes.
Let's say he's taken it from a bank. Yeah, so you make your judgment, and then what kind of culpability are you going to attribute to our person? And let's see what kind of sentence you think that he's going to get, or she.
Well, the starting point of 5 years is based on $1 million. But Oh, no, I beg your pardon. That was putting culpability in B. I'm afraid I would put the culpability from your example at 7 years.
Oh, wow.
Because I tell you why, because I would try to argue it down, but I would think there is significant planning because it takes a while to fill out mortgage application forms and things like that. And so the range, 5 to 8 years custody, starting point based on $1 million, I would think, provided the person hasn't done anything like this before, I would be hopeful of 5 years at the most.
5 years, okay, not bad.
But, you know, if you could get it lower, then...
Let me give you 2 pieces of information, listeners, about what Leslie's background. She did actually prosecute benefit fraud cases as well, so she's got in-depth knowledge about these things. That's why she can confidently say it'll be high culpability rather than medium or lower. And obviously, because of her experience in these types of matters, I can tell you that this isn't guesswork that she's putting in. This is actually factually correct, and she's probably right. And our job, obviously, would be then to mitigate as much as we can and basically put the correct facts, not speculative facts, into the scenario so we can get you or a person sentenced appropriately. And that is something that Leslie is particularly good at, I should say.
That's very kind of...
Okay, Leslie, so you've taken us through how the guidelines in sentencing works, and I'm sure that the listeners have found that interesting. Now let's look... well, actually, I want to ask you something, actually. I've looked at your profile, and you've done some huge fraud cases, and one in particular that interests me. The case of R versus G, and a cheat on the revenue for 1.2 million by 2 defendants. Give us an update on that. Tell us what happened in that case.
That case was a really fascinating case, actually, because the defendants, I'd rather not name them because not embarrass them, but basically... Just
bear with me 1 second.
I'm so sorry.
That's right. Listeners, we can't actually name the defendants if we wanted to, because the courts are open courts and people can go in there. What we're doing is refraining from naming them, although the case facts are known publicly, it's in the public domain. Sorry, Leslie, I just thought if anybody got alarmed that we're talking about defendants.
Yes, thank you for explaining that, because... As you say, it's all been in the public domain. It's not anything confidential, but I just rather not embarrass clients if I can avoid that. Yes. Well, they were very bright people, and they were husband and wife, and they set up a very successful company, and they owed corporation tax in the sum of £1.2 million to the revenue.
They've done all right if they owe 1.2 million in tax.
And it was very successful.
Yeah.
They paid $250,000.
Right.
But the revenue claimed that their account of, as it were, spending money and running it through various countries in the world was a sham device to cheat the revenue out of the 1.2 million. And they had argued constantly that they had been told they wouldn't be prosecuted. And there was never any evidence of that. And what happened was, I was co-defending with a very brilliant tax lawyer, actually. So I was the criminal side, he was the tax side. And we had piles and piles of disclosure, and we were assured that disclosure had been done properly. And we just read absolutely everything.
Yeah.
And noticed that one of the numbers was different to the files we've got. So that then alerted us to the fact there was another file. And in that file, there was the agreement whereby they made a further payment, and they've been given immunity from prosecution.
Tell us about that then. So what had happened? The revenue had told them they wouldn't be prosecuted if they paid back some money.
That's right. They'd come to this agreement, and this had been, as it were, buried, not deliberately by anybody, and they'd had previous solicitors, counsel.
Wow.
They'd had one abusive process argument ruled against, and so when we found this, we were able to go back and renew that application, and therefore the prosecution came to an end.
Well, so they backtracked and they took the prosecution out of the court.
Oh no! The judge stopped it because of what was found in that file. But as I say, we've been assured all the time we had everything, but we didn't. So.
And where was this discussion not to, or this agreement not to prosecute? Where was it recorded? Was it recorded officially? Or?
Yes. Yeah.
Wow. And then they said you say accidentally, or not deliberately, they ignored that and they went forward with it. And I'm just conscious of the time. We've got 20 seconds left. I will carry on with this discussion, and we will carry on this discussion after the break, listeners. We've got plenty to get through to, and we're going to speak about the actual offences and how they're committed as well. So, inshallah, see you after the break.
Assalamu alaikum, this is Atif Nawaz. Listen to Inspire FM shows in your time by heading over to inspirefm.org or listen on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, listeners. Welcome back to the show. This is Gais Uddin on the airwaves 105.1 FM, Inspire FM. You can call us on 01582 481 822 or 07779 481 822 for WhatsApp and text messages. It's the Ask Your Lawyer show, and I'm joined by the lovely Leslie Manley of Church Court, and we've been talking about fraud. How it's committed, what the sentencing powers are. And Leslie very kindly gave us an anecdote about some of the cases that she's been on. Now, Leslie, you've been working as a barrister, or you were called as a barrister in 1983, is that correct?
It is.
You certainly don't look old enough for 1983 call, Leslie.
You're very kind. Very kind.
Tell us about some of the work that you do, some of the general work that you do. I know you do, it's just not fraud that you do other stuff as well, don't you?
I do. I have now concentrated on defence work only for the last about 10 years, really. And I have a mixed assortment of work. So, for instance, this year I've had human trafficking case, sexual offences, blackmail, kidnap. Last week, 2 robberies, a robbery trial and another plea on a robbery. Today, aggravated burglary. So it's quite a mixture of work, really, different types of cases.
Do you do any civil work, or is it just criminal work?
Now it's just criminal. When I started off, the first 7 years, I did mixed common law. And so you could be in the county court one day on a possession action, Chancery Division the next day on contempt, magistrates, and then Crown. But now I just concentrate on the one thing.
And what keeps you motivated to do this job?
Well, I just love it. And I'm very lucky because I generally work with really nice people. You're one of them.
You don't need to be kind to me.
What I did want to say is that for people who are facing possibility of being accused of benefit fraud. You mentioned earlier the work of a solicitor and trying to achieve appropriate sentence and so forth, but what can happen with benefit fraud is because it's not at a police station, people quite wrongly think it's some sort of cosy chat they're going to have, or they're not really aware of the seriousness and that they're being interviewed under caution, Police and Criminal Evidence Act.
Well, we're going to go into that. We're going to certainly go into that, and I'm going to ask your opinions, and I'm sure the listeners will be interested to know whether they should be instructing lawyers or not in these types of cases when they're told, oh, don't worry about it, it's not that serious. Okay, let's look at the offences, and we can work our way through them, can't we? Yeah?
Yes.
So the types of frauds that we typically come across. Fraud by false representation. What is a fraud by false representation?
It's really, I would just call it for the average person. I would just basically say it's telling a lie. It's being deceitful. So the example I gave of somebody going on holiday, having a great time, putting the pictures of a great time on Facebook, and then coming back and saying, I was really ill. I want my insurance money or whatever. The same, the going into the bank examples. That's false. You're saying it's not true, it's not your bank account. You're not entitled to that money. So I think there's the Fraud Act, there's other pieces of legislation, but if citizens, people just think, am I being honest? Am I telling the truth, or am I telling a lie? That's really the key to.
Wouldn't most frauds involve some kind of false representation, though, Leslie? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, they would, wouldn't they? Because I'm struggling to think how you would basically commit a fraud without giving some kind of inaccurate information somewhere. You'd have to, really, wouldn't you? And yet there is a specific offence of this false representation. Maybe someday we'll figure out what is fraud by failing to disclose information. What's that?
Well, an example that comes to my mind from one of my actual cases is a lady who had been on benefits for many years, and she was entitled to these benefits, and her two young children had savings accounts. She then had an inheritance. Her father was very wealthy, and he had quite a lot of property. So she then inherited this money. Now, what she should have done was disclose that to the benefit authorities. Yeah. She didn't. What she did instead was put it into her children's accounts. And even though the children had different family names, the accounts were actually very successful, and they earned a lot of interest. And however it's done with the software triggered off some sort of alarm to the DWP, and then it all came to light through the computer picking up that these were her children and making links and so on. So that's one example, I think, that she was supposed to give that information, it was a lot of money she'd inherited, and she didn't. So that's one example. That's
an example of the omission, I suppose. They're failing to disclose something, aren't you? Wow. Yeah. Okay. Abuse of position. What's an abuse of position when it comes to fraud? I'll try to give us an example, Leslie, if you know one. I suppose we touched upon it earlier, didn't we? Yeah.
I think we did. You gave that good example. Suppose you were a mortgage broker and you knew various deals were coming on offer, and you thought that you could maybe buy a property for yourself, but you didn't have the relevant savings or whatever, and you made false representations to get the mortgage.
I see. I was going to ask you quickly one thing when it comes down to those kind of abuse of position. The offence of insider dealing and insider trading, would that cross over into this, where you would obviously know you could abuse your position and predict what's going to happen, or know even some deals going through, and then would that come under the fraud lines and fraud guidelines?
Well, I'll be honest, I'm not sure what piece of legislation it would be prosecuted under, but it certainly would be, because there you are, you're privy to information that no one else has, and you're using it to rig the market, as it were, or benefit yourself. I think so.
I mean, as I've been researching this show, there's been plenty of examples of those kind of offences compared to the ones that we hear about in every single tabloid, which is benefit fraud. And I can assure you, listeners, there's a massive discrepancy in the amounts that we're talking about. And there's I would, obviously, as a defence, coming from a defence background, I'm going to be accused of saying these kind of things, and being sympathetic to people who commit fraud. I'm not, I can assure you that. But I sometimes do wonder why so much resource is put into investigating benefit fraud claims when other kind of frauds, which are done higher level, they seem to be less
well investigated.
Yeah, well, not investigated. I'm sure they investigate, but less well publicised, I'd say. Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, that seems anomalous to me. Anyway, I digress.
Well, actually, this might be, if you don't mind me mentioning it now, a good time to say that if you are unfortunate enough to be called in for a DWP interview, you are entitled to free and independent legal advice, and people don't often realise that. And it can make a big difference, because it can make all the difference between whether you're cautioned, whether you're prosecuted at all even. So I really would, should anyone be in that unfortunate position, I really would say you're told you're entitled to free and independent legal advice, call up Gais Uddin or a solicitor and be represented, because these interviews can be quite challenging.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you make, Leslie. Because, and as I say, this isn't a plug for us in particular. You should, I think it's good advice that Leslie's given, that you should be undertaking the services of a solicitors, because in these types of interviews they don't actually charge you. They are covered by legal aid, so you can have a solicitor there, and I'm sure Leslie will agree with me that in the long run, if you are prosecuted, then it does help your barrister to help you in court as well. And in the short term, obviously you have somebody there, even for comfort's sake, you have somebody there assisting you. So it wouldn't make sense not to take a solicitor with you. So and in fairness, whether it's a local authority prosecution or UW, I've never seen a scenario where they haven't offered a client a solicitor. It's just that the clients have sometimes thought, well, I don't need one. Don't fall into that trap where you think everything's going to be okay. You're being asked to give an interview under caution for a specific reason, and it's because they think that you've been dishonest. Leslie, we were going to talk about false accounting next.
Well, false accounting is really when you're misrepresenting the true position, either of an individual or a company. I get to use the colloquial expression, you're cooking the books, basically. You're just saying, I hope that's not too...
No, of course not. No. I think that's the best phrase to use in the circumstances.
I think, you're misrepresenting the real position, and you can be doing that for a number of reasons. You can be doing it to get a lower VAT bill or a lower revenue bill than you should be, for instance, or you can be doing it misguidedly to help out a company. If you're an accountant, you can think, well, they're in trouble, but they can trade their way out of it. So you're allowing them to fraudulently trade by misrepresenting their position. So, yeah, I think to keep it as simple as possible, that's what you're doing. You're just putting the figures that are there are not correct, really.
Fine. And I suppose the victims off the back of that could be, one, revenue and customs, or two, the shareholders in the company. They all could get.
Well, yes, and also people who trade with companies, because if you think a company's solvent and you give them goods or material on credit, and then actually they're not really solvent, they're never going to pay you.
That's a brilliant point.
Serious, yeah.
Creditors, you're right. Creditors. Okay. The next one, which is interesting, possessing, making, or supplying articles for use in fraud. Possessing them for fraud. What kind of things could someone possess to use in a fraud?
Well, all sorts, really. For instance, false documents, false passports.
Yeah.
I had a case where it was global, sophisticated fraud, and the top of the gang, if I call it that, the head people, was selling globally holidays and accommodation that didn't exist.
Right.
But to launder the money, they were getting quite vulnerable people who'd come here to get jobs and work but fallen on hard times. They were providing them with false passports and false identification documents so they could open bank accounts in false names and launder the money through the bank accounts. And in that case, the man who did the forgery or the supply of those false documents, he got quite a significant sentence because the judge said, if it weren't for your activities, it wouldn't have been so easy for all these others to be opening these fake bank accounts. And they had to have high quality fake identification.
Wow.
So that's one thing. There are machines as well that people can attach to ATMs to divert cash to them, as it were. That's another example that I can think of.
Let's go to the classic fraud that everyone thinks of, revenue fraud. What is revenue fraud for VAT and those kind of things? Just give us a general overview. What kind of examples do people do? What kind of things do they do? I know we may have covered it already, but I think it would be good to alert our listeners about the pitfalls and things that they can accidentally get into, thinking, well, I'll just do that, and it's actually offence. I heard that representing a check that isn't going to cash is a fraud. Isn't that correct?
That's right. Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It's really, well, a classic example would just be misrepresenting your expenses. If you're doing a tax return and saying, I stayed at this hotel because I was on a case in Manchester, whereas actually you were on holiday with your family or something, and it's not a proper deductible offence. Expense. Yes.
So that's considered a fraud, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. If you're setting off expenses against the revenue, you would say, this has been my income, this has been my expenditure, such as running the office, that sort of thing. But if you inflated the expenses artificially to lower your profit, to lower your tax liability, that would be fraud. Same with VAT.
It's exactly the same with VAT. The final things that I want to go into in reality with fraud is benefit fraud. Let's talk about the simple benefit frauds that the traps that they can fall into. What kind of benefit frauds are there? I know that we've gone on about false representations and not declaring things. I think that's the basis of benefit fraud, isn't it?
Yes, it is. The very common one is working and claiming.
Yeah.
So people are working. It could be in any industry, retail, taxi driving, and so forth. And they think...
But that's a very obvious one. The ones that I tend to see people get caught out in not declaring change in circumstances. Explain those ones for us, Leslie.
Yes. Well, there was the example I gave of the lady who inherited money. And she should have said... somebody... It's one of the things that the courts address is whether something starts dishonestly.
Right.
So if you've got a job and then you put in a claim and you know full well it's just a fraud.
Yeah.
That's treated more severely than if, for instance, you're on benefits and you then get a job.
Yeah.
And then you think, well, I'm struggling a bit, but I'll tell them next week.
Right.
And you never do.
Fine.
That's fraudulent
So
behaviour.
what you're saying is if you're fraudulent from the outset, that's the words that they use, isn't it?
Yes.
Basically, you make the benefit claim and then you start working, you're fraudulent from the outset because you knew exactly what you were doing. You started it fraudulently.
Yes.
Yeah, you made a declaration saying, I'm not working when you were. Whereas if you're not claiming I suppose not. Say if you're claiming and not working, and then it happens later on, then they see it more favourably towards you.
Yeah, so a legitimate claim that became dishonest and fraudulent. Of course, it depends the circumstance, how long it went on for. If it's gone on for years.
It's interesting that because basically, obviously, doing some of these cases, you sometimes just see the amounts involved, specifically in housing and council tax benefit, because those payments are huge, aren't they, Leslie?
They are. They really mount up over.
Yeah, and people can technically be guilty or involved in fraud cases amounting to hundreds of thousands of pounds because they've been claiming over years. Isn't that correct? Yeah,
that's absolutely correct. Yeah,
and then you can easily fall into those long prison sentence categories, can't you?
You can. Sometimes I've had the experience of client. They're a bit frightened. And they don't know the system. So I actually had a client she was a waitress and she was prosecuted. And actually, had she told the benefit people she was working the hours that she was, she would have actually been fine because she was entitled to a top-up benefit. Yeah. And she didn't know that. Yeah. And so that was a great shame of a case, really. Yeah,
I've had a couple of those as well. I've had one example where basically, typically people say, if you're claiming housing benefit, you shouldn't be living in a relative's house. But in reality, what you should be doing is declaring it to the authorities, and then they make a decision about it. Rather than, I've seen it a few times where people have said, well, technically, if you just told us and there wasn't another property, you might have been entitled to stay there, but give us the choice rather than you make it and don't tell us. And another one interesting as well, Leslie, actually, it's about a benefit fraud that was committed by not declaring somebody else living in the house. And again, they said, well, you simply had to tell us that they were the earning person who was earning living there, and we could have made our own decision. But those are the kind of issues that I find a lot of our clients get caught up in. They haven't intended to go out and do anything deliberately, like start working after they're claiming benefits, which is, I think, quite obvious that you're committing a fraud there. Whereas something where you fail to, somebody's moved into your house for a long time, they're working, you're supposed to tell them if you're getting any money off them, or if they're working anyway, you're supposed to just declare it. And those kind of instances I've seen, people do get caught unaware. And they've got to be careful, haven't they, Leslie, in these circumstances? Because you do sign declarations to say, I've checked.
Yes, and it is a shame, as you say, because they just get caught up in something. And I think sometimes fear affects people. They're worried. But in fact, as you say, they just told people. And then it would probably work out for them, and that the authorities would know and they can make the decision.
They could make the decision, because at the end of the day, all you can do is make the declaration and let the authorities decide. And if they say to you, well, no, if that person lives in your house, you're not going to get benefit, you can ask the person to leave, I suppose. Couldn't you? Or you could make an appeal, I suppose. We've basically covered most of the offences, so I want to basically just give you a last word about money laundering when it comes down to these four types of offences. So tell us about the money laundering regulations, because they affect fraud cases, don't they?
They do. I mean, regarding money laundering, the money laundering really comes about from a number of criminal enterprises, I would call them. So when people make money from crimes, and often a lot of it, obviously they're doing it to make money, to keep the money, so they're trying to hide it. And there are so many ways that can be done, really. That's why it's called laundering, really, isn't it? To wash the money sort of thing. So they do it by many different ways. Putting it... Often people will have partners who haven't got a criminal record of any sort, so they will want to access their bank accounts. They'll run it through their husband or wife's or partner's bank account. Or businesses that do operate but are really pretty much a sham. I had one client in Manchester who was very prolific in the drugs world, shall we say. And he, of course, owned a number of, it was at gyms and martial arts centres that were really the device for him to run the money through that. But yes, I mean, in a nutshell, converting criminal property, really.
Yeah, so essentially what it seems to me that the government are looking to do is recover the money that they think that you've made it illegitimately, should we say. And in these types of circumstances, they will actually go at people who have committed benefit fraud, won't they? Even though technically they could be saying, well, look, you've given me housing council tax benefit and it's gone into the paying the rent.
Yes.
I've actually got the money. But they will look to recover still, won't they?
They will. And yes, I think I'm right in saying that initially it was envisaged the Proceeds of Crime Act would impact on drug offences.
Dealers, yeah.
But, as you know, it's used in a huge number of cases, burglaries, robberies, where benefits can be found and calculated.
I mean, in fairness, to be honest with you, Leslie, what I've seen is they're quite hit and miss in terms of how much they investigate. And some investigators going very deep and some tend to be a bit more relaxed about these things. I mean, I think it's a good initiative. It's not a bad initiative. I can see the thinking behind it. It's just that I find it strange that they go after... If someone's made a clear benefit fraud and they've made a benefit from it, fair enough. But I think that you can cross the lines here. Leslie, we've only got 20 seconds to go. I really, really do appreciate you coming down today. It's been a very, very informative show. I hope our listeners have taken away as much as I have. Just before we go, join us next week for another segment on Ask Your Lawyer. And a shout out to my cousin Mahima, who's recovering from a contagious disease. Assalamu alaikum. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. We stream our daily broadcast on inspirefm.org. You'll find all our daily updates on our social media at Inspire FM Luton.